When societies were closed, we were closed off from each other by the Iron Curtain, which cut across Europe and was an electrified barrier between them and us. And this barrier didn't just affect the movement of peoples, it obviously affected it also affected information. So we have electrified borders. I'd forgotten for many years what that sound was like. It was really hard to hear the original broadcast in the first place, and what you can hear in that little extract is both the original text in Russian from the BBC, followed by the jamming, cutting in, and blocking it out for listeners. There was no news from the West into the Soviet Union. It was jammed, by and large. Radio Liberty was jammed all the time, 24 hours, 24/7, 365 of the days of the year. BBC and Voice of America were only jammed intermittently. So when I started in 1977 at the BBC Russian service, we weren't jammed. Jamming came on when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and then the jamming came back on. And it came on again with full force. That's a slightly unusual example, because normally the jamming came on at the beginning of the broadcast and you couldn't hear anything. I used to be sent in every couple of years to listen to jamming, just to check the frequencies. And wherever I went, whether it was Kiev, whether it was Baku, whether it was Yerevan, whether it was Tbilisi, or Leningrad or Moscow, it was all jammed. We did not know whether we had an audience. We knew nothing. We were working in the dark. And there was a little rhyme that used to go around in the Soviet Union, and it went like this. Есть привычка на Руси ночью слушать BBC. There is a habit in Russia to listen to the BBC at night. And at night was the time for listening. Night was the time when your neighbors weren't around. Night was the time when the signal was stronger. But who was listening? Why were they listening? We had absolutely no idea. It was also extremely difficult to get news out of Russia, out of the Soviet Union. BBC for Soviet Union covered 240 million people, 15 republics, 240 million people. Guess how many correspondents the BBC had to cover that enormous space? One. One correspondent in Moscow with a translator who is obviously KGB and a fixer who is obviously KGB. So there was one single person to provide all the news for the whole of the BBC. They were not allowed to travel outside Moscow. So they could not report from the field. The news was exclusively, I mean not exclusively because they had access to the press, they had access to other reports, but it was mainly Moscow-based news and mainly official-based news, unless the correspondent had a special interest in the dissident movement. And in the 70s and the 80s, there was a brilliant Moscow correspondent who had really good relations with the dissident movement. He was able to interview Sakharov because he was known and he was trusted. The dissidents would come to him with news, and there's a famous story about, I don't know if anybody remembers, Roy Medvedev, the Marxist historian who was placed in a lunatic asylum because of his views. No doubt they thought he was crazy, because how could a Marxist possibly write anti-Soviet history? But Roy Medvedev was let out of his psychiatric hospital. He went back home, turned on the radio, and heard the news of his release from hospital on the BBC. Some things we knew. It was because his brother, his twin brother Zhores, had called the BBC and said, my brother's coming out of hospital. And so we broadcast it, and so he was able to hear it when as he walked through the door of his apartment. These kind of things, this was possible. It was also, this was the time when we had, in the 80s, in the late 70s and 80s, we also had the development of the Helsinki agreements. Everybody has forgotten Jimmy Carter. I mean, you know, they haven't forgotten him, but everybody thinks of Jimmy Carter as the loser. The guy, the one-term president, the guy who didn't do anything. Jimmy Carter, from my perspective, is one of the founding fathers of the destruction of the Soviet Union and communist ideology. Why? Because of Basket 5 of the Helsinki Agreements, which was about human rights. And that enabled a bunch of people in the Soviet Union to come together to report on human rights violations that were taking place in the country. There was the bulletin that they produced. The bulletin was basically the only information that enabled people in the provinces, in the regions of the Soviet Union, to get news into Moscow. So they had a network. This was it was not that good a means of doing it, because the only people that they covered were people like themselves, human rights activists, people who did that. The working class did not get a look in. So if there were any labor disputes or anything like that, we did not know. They did not have the contacts with the Moscow dissidents. So the picture that we could portray was, in a way, extremely distorted, simply because one person cannot cover everything. You cannot get out. You couldn't get out into the regions to cover stuff. The labor revolt that took place, I think, back in 1956 in Novocherkassk, when there was a big locomotive factory in Novocherkassk. They went on strike over pay, and there was a little rebellion down there, and several people got shot. The news of that did not come out of until the end of the Soviet Union. There were rumors about it, but nothing documented. The documentation only came very, very much later, because they were buried down in Novocherkassk, right in the south of Russia, and there was no access to these people. Anyway, so we were broadcasting through jamming, no concept of audience, absolutely none. We did not know who they were, where they were, why they were, and what they were. Nothing. And part of, yes. So, but this creates in itself a very specific kind of editorial practice, which is you as the editor, and I was an editor for several years, I had my own program department, you do not know what it is that people want. My boss said to me, I want to do a program for farmers, kolhozniks, and I said, I can't do it. And he said, why not? I said, I don't know anything about kolhozniks. I do not know what interests them. I do not know what they think. I do not know what their ambitions are. I do not know who they are. For me, they are complete. And all my staff were artists, they were writers, they were literary scholars. They knew nothing about the countryside either. They'd never been in the countryside. They didn't know anybody in the countryside. There was an absolute mass, blank mass that we did not know. We could not do programs for the working class either. We could do programs for youth because we could play rock music. And it was hugely successful. I mean, that was our biggest pull. I mean, it was our only means of communicating with the audience, because the kids didn't care. They would write us letters and ask for music. So you develop a style of editing, which is you do what you think is interesting. And it's what I call a push-out form. It's not that different to what other people were doing. Mainstream media editors were doing at the time anyway. I mean, editors did what editors thought they should do, which is tell people what's going on. So that, you know, television news, it's a classic push-out form. An editor decides on the running order. He decides what's going to get more, what's going to get less, what's going at the top, what's going at the bottom. And if he wants to put, as some of our news writers down in the news department at the BBC, if they wanted to put news about cricket in Zimbabwe, they put in cricket in Zimbabwe, much to the puzzlement of many people in the Soviet Union who weren't interested in cricket in Zimbabwe, but we had a lot of Australians working in the newsroom. They were interested in cricket. For them it was important. And it might be important for World Service in English, but it wasn't important for our Russians. But you got what you got. I had a lot of freedom. Some people didn't have a lot of freedom. News department dictated what went out in the news segment. I had 5 hours a week in which I did what I wanted. Nobody ever asked. It was quite interesting. So yeah, so we had you have the push-out mode of communication. This begins to change with Gorbachev. I know Gorbachev is hugely popular in Germany. He was hated in Russia in the end for destroying the Soviet Union. But what Gorbachev did, that he did some very, very simple things which actually transformed people's lives completely. The first thing that he did, I mean, besides lifting jamming, but he did that slightly, he lifted jamming on the BBC and he lifted jamming on Radio Liberty later. But the first thing that happened was the opening of the phone lines. When it became possible to dial into the Soviet Union and out of the Soviet Union. We discovered the audience. We discovered that we had an audience. First of all, when the phone lines opened, somebody came into my office and said, "Frank, I want to do a phone interview with Moscow." And I said, "No. Sorry, not going to do it." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Very simple. You and I are here. Nothing's going to happen to us. He is there. If anything changes in the next 6 months, if Gorbachev goes, that's it. That person is in deep trouble. No, we are not putting people in danger." So the guy comes back a few weeks later and says, "Frank, I want to do he was a very stubborn guy. "I want to do a phone call with Russia." And I said, "No, we're not doing it." And then he came back to me a little later and he said, "Frank, Winnie the Pooh." I said, "Yes, Winnie the Pooh." He said, "It's an English book." And I said, "Yes." He said, "It's a children's book." I said, "Yes." He said, "Not political." I said, "No, it's not political." "Okay, it's not political." "Well," he said, the Russian translator of Winnie the Pooh is, I think, 89 or something today. I want to call him and wish him happy birthday. Is that okay?" And I said, "Okay, he'll do it." So he goes and he dials the number, he calls the guy. The guy picks up the phone and the person introduces himself. "My name is Pavel. I am calling you from the BBC Russian service." Boom, straight down. He tries again. Dials the number, the phone goes up. He says, "I'm Pavel. I'm from the BBC Russian service." And the guy says, "This is a provocation." Puts the phone down. Stubborn guy. He dials again. He says, "Don't put the phone down. Just wait. I want to wish you happy birthday and I want to record an interview." And so that was the first interview that was done with the Soviet Union between London and Moscow. And after that, it kind of snowballed. After that, we had, glasnost and perestroika came along, and we had to increase our broadcasting hours with no extra funding. What you do if you have no extra funding and 2 hours extra a day, you play music. So I got a guy in to do some music. He was doing more music, and he got bored, and he said, "I want to call people in the Soviet Union. I want them to call me. I want to talk to them, find out what they're thinking." And I said, "Okay, fine." And he said, "But the only way they'll do that is if I give them a prize." Now, since we had no contact with the Soviet Union, I didn't have a budget. No budget. I said, well, what am I going to give him? He said, I don't know, you think of something. So I had a thought, and I called the record companies in Oxford Street and in London, and I said, do you have any spare junk that you want to get rid of? And they said, yeah, we got loads of it. And so they just gave me all these LPs, because that was still vinyl in those days, and we would send out LPs to anybody who called in. And it started slowly, but within a couple of weeks, we were getting 90, he did it one day a week, we got 90 calls. And we discovered that we had an audience all the way across the Soviet Union, in places that we had never heard of. Like, not just Novosibirsk, but Barnaul. Okay, go figure where Barnaul is. You know, I mean, all these places that suddenly these people were calling in. We were saying, how old are you? We're doing all the audience research that we had never done before. The Soviet Union began to change in such a way that was unbelievable. And we got, so this is the first revolution. This is Gorbachev. Why did Gorbachev do it? There are all sorts of, you know, possible reasons why he did it, but it happened. So the revolution was political. We moved from, I mean, I love working under Brezhnev. It was so easy, absolutely easy. You could plan your programming 5 years in advance, literally, because nothing was going to change. Nothing. Really easy. And then it got like this. So, yes to reforms and democracy. Yeah, the people of Vladimir for the president. You know, I mean, so you change, the whole thing sort of, it went up. So we have a political revolution. And we also have an economic revolution. Gosplan to the market economy. That was fairly dramatic. But we also have at the same time the technological revolution which is taking place in the West, which enables us to do all sorts of things. So we go from tape recorders, which are clunky and difficult, to computers, which are nice and simple. In the analog age, we could not record telephone calls in a BBC, except in a BBC studio. Impossible. So you had to book. You couldn't do interviews with the Soviet Union because A, if you went through an operator, you'd have to book 2 days in advance. B, you'd have to book a studio in advance, and then you probably wouldn't be able to get through. Moving to digital, we could record telephone calls. We could do all sorts of things that we were never able to do before. The whole, there are these revolutions which are taking place at the same time, which just made life so much easier and so much, you know, snail mail to the email. I mean, you know, instant communication. It was incredible. And so we moved to open societies. Moved to open societies all the way across the communist bloc. Communist bloc comes to an end, which are characterized by no borders, or at least minimal borders. People can travel. For most people, the concept of democracy was that you could travel. For Russians in particular, if you said to them, what is democracy? They say, oh, I can travel. But it was huge. I mean, people traveled within the Soviet bloc, but suddenly they became, people used to travel to Vilnius and to Lithuania so they could look across the border to the other side. People in Czechoslovakia used to travel up to the north of Poland so that they could look, or north of East Germany, so they could perhaps see Denmark in the distance. So the elimination of borders was a huge deal. We got super abundant news. I took part in that development because by that time I was working in Munich, and and with the phones opening up, being able to record telephone calls, we began to build a network of correspondence in what was still the Soviet Union, which soon came down. But we were able to build a network of correspondence in the Soviet Union for the first time. We had people working in Estonia. We had reporting from Estonia. We had people reporting from Kiev, from Baku, from Tbilisi, from Siberia, from all these places. And these were not seasoned reporters. These were kids aged about 18, 19, who just wanted to take part in this, because finally you could do something. And it created huge conflict within the radio, because a lot of people didn't trust them. They said, this is KGB, this is all complete plant. These kids are, you know, they're not genuine. They're making it all up. It was a huge leap of faith on our part to use these young people to do the reporting. It was also extremely difficult, because still in those days it could take you an hour to get a phone line. I don't know if anybody else here has ever tried dialing into the former Soviet Union with a regular analog telephone. We didn't have mobiles then yet. It could take an hour to dial up to make a call. And you'd be sitting in a studio, and you'd have something, you wanted something big, something big was happening, and you need a story. You'd dial, and 5 minutes before airtime, you got a line, and the line was garbage. It was like the jamming. You couldn't hear it. You could barely hear it. Did you record that and put it on air, or did you try again? You know, you could be in a situation. I mean, there were all sorts of things going on in this period. You know, there was stuff in Baku going on. There was stuff in Vilnius going on. There were people being shot. There were all sorts of bad things happening, and you took your chances. And I remember one morning for a morning show, got through after 45 minutes to Baku. The line was garbage, and I thought, what do I do? I put the phone down. I redialed, second try, the line came back, and it was okay. But sometimes it didn't work. So yes, so we had huge volumes of information coming in from places that we'd never been able to talk to before. And an absolutely new kind of information coming in, because we were able to talk both to the striking miners up in Vorkuta in the Arctic, and we were able to talk to the politicians who were beginning to come through as well. So we had access to a whole range of people, and we were also able to visit as journalists and go in and talk to people in a way that we'd not been able to do before. That was a big difference as well. Big process of discovery and a lot of optimism. And we had the audience, which were at this point very enthusiastic. And at this time also came the internet. We were discussing in Mo i Rana, when did the internet start? And we said it started 1994. It became open. But the internet, 1994, am I right?
It was
public available in 1994. Yeah, I mean, it began before that, but 1994 it became publicly available. So, I mean, you know, this was a huge, for us it was a huge deal. The internet and the things that you could do with internet. So, what could you do with the internet? You could exchange information between people in ways you could not do before. You began blogs, podcasts. That had a revolutionary effect. Citizen journalism. This is a little bit later. This is already beginning of 2000 that you begin to get blogs, podcasts, citizen journalists, and interactivity. The information exchange began a little bit earlier. When you were able to put stuff up on FTP, file transfer protocol. I mentioned that up in Mo i Rana, and that this is ancient history now. You know, this is. I thought I was a dinosaur by talking about jamming, but I was a real dinosaur because even FTP was kind of stuff. But FTP was kind of cool because it meant that I was director of the BBC School of Broadcast Journalism in Yekaterinburg. You could only do audio files. I mean, you could do text files, but in terms of broadcast, you could only send audio files. And a 3-minute, I mean, it's unimaginable now, a 3-minute audio file took over an hour to download. And you had the phone modem, and if the phone modem went down at any point in that, if it went down at 2 minutes 54 seconds, you had to go all the way back to the beginning again. But the kids in the school used to put up their stories onto FTP, and I would download it to my home, and I would write a critique and send it back to them, my critique by email. So when they left the school in the previous evening, they would send the stuff, and in the morning when they came in, there would be a critique from the boss in the UK. They thought that was super cool. And I enjoyed doing it too. It began to bring Russia really, and we began to develop concepts then of exchanging information between radio stations inside Russia. What the 90s meant for at least broadcast journalism, I cannot talk about print media, but what the 90s meant for broadcast journalism was a huge explosion in independent media. I was traveling around talking to people in radio stations all over the place, and there were all these people who had started radio stations and wanted to provide local information for local people that was honest, open, and reflected their interests, and it was everywhere. There was even a little radio station in the town of Kropotkin. Town of Kropotkin, if anybody, if you remember your political history, Kropotkin was, of course, the great anarchist. And there's a little town named after him down in southern Russia, halfway between Rostov-on-Don and Krasnodar. And the owners of this little radio station asked me to visit them, so I went to visit them way down there. And but even a little town like Kropotkin, which had it's a bit bigger than Mo i Rana, but not much. That had a radio station doing local news. They wanted to know how to do local news properly. We had contacts in Ulan-Ude, out beyond Irkutsk. There were stations everywhere. Some of them were music stations, some of them were, but some of them did 50-50. They've all gone. I mean, it's all been closed down. It all began to close down after 2000 and the arrival of Mr. Putin on the scene as president. But in the late second half of the 90s was such a dynamic period, and information exchange was a big thing that we were trying to promote between local radio stations. But for working for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, what was important for us at that time were blogs and podcasts, citizen journalists, and interactivity. The blogs and podcasts meant, and I think it wasn't just for us; it was for a lot of other publications as well. It gave journalists the ability to have their own voice. The thing about a BBC journalist and about a Radio Liberty journalist is that the journalist is not allowed to express their own opinion. The saying was, when I started at the BBC, was you hung your opinions up with your coat when you came through the door. Surprisingly, Radio Liberty also developed the same policy of a prohibition on personal commentary. Blogs and podcasts were an opportunity for journalists to express their own views, albeit in journalistic form. and develop a personality. In one sense, this was hugely positive, because one thing that, I mean, certainly for people in Eastern Europe, because one thing that people wanted to know was what you thought. It was always the first question. What do you think? But it also, it's a two-edged sword, because people who write news should not do blogs and podcasts, because news, you know, what they write in there may conflict with what they're having to report on as a news reporter. It's a big issue, this whole personalization of news. Interactivity was very important, because if we had discovered an audience, in this we began to discover what they thought. It changes the way in which an editor operates. It changes the psychology of the editor. He is no longer a person who puts out stuff. He is a person who has to have interchange with the people who are receiving this stuff. And people in the former Soviet Union had great interest in expressing their views, finally, openly, to somebody else. They took part in interactivity with huge enthusiasm. So then you get problems of moderation and so on and so forth, unacceptable views. But we began to talk to the audience, as we did with and citizen journalism takes the development of regional correspondence a step further when ordinary people send in their stories. Where have we got stuck? That's it. So this changes, as I was saying, this changes the way in which the editor works. The editor is no longer a dictator who tells people what they should know. The editor becomes an enabler in a dialogue between the audience and the news institution. He cannot just ignore the audience. He has to pull the audience in. This is very important. It's less important for commercial media, because commercial media operates on ads, and if you're not successful, if you don't have ratings, your boss doesn't get paid. They're unhappy. For publicly funded radio or television, they get paid whatever they do. Doesn't matter. Ratings do not essentially matter for publicly funded media, particularly if you're broadcasting to a foreign audience, where it's kind of hard to get a gauge on listenership and so on. And so there is a huge temptation for people just to write whatever it is they want to write, push it out. This editor as an enabler meant a revolution in the mindset of a lot of people working for places like the BBC and for Radio Liberty, in that they had to work, they had to understand the audience and what it wanted. I had a colleague who worked in, who was head of the Tajik service. And she was not a great intellect. And in the morning editorial meetings where all the service directors gathered together, if she made a comment, there would be a certain amount of sniggering in the room, because it wouldn't be very sophisticated. There were a lot more sophisticated people in the room than she was. But she was the only person to increase an audience on shortwave. The only person to increase, I know, who ever increased an audience on shortwave after the Cold War. Why? Because her heart beat with the audience. She just had an instinct for what the themes that the audience, that would resonate with an audience. She understood the audience. She was not sophisticated, and therefore understood what less sophisticated people wanted. How she should communicate with them. In what format, in what form. They had a brilliant youth program. which we supported. I mean, I was at one point doing marketing, so I organized a youth concert in Dushanbe, which it worked really well. They had a terrific youth show because she understood how they thought. The others were kind of intellectual. They understood, you know, news and this kind of stuff and politics. But their audiences were stuck. They were absolutely flatlining. Radio Liberty audiences only ever increased at times of crisis. That's what a friend of mine who worked in the Russian service said. Radio Liberty is a radio for crisis. The rest of the time, nobody listens. But it's when things are bad, that's when people actually listen, which is not the right approach of just keeping going on just in the hope, maybe, that something bad is going to happen, and then perhaps you'll get an audience and the numbers will go up. Anyway, so yes, pull in. People had to pull in. And you know, this has happened not just in foreign broadcasting, but elsewhere too. That era comes to an end about, what, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? And so we moved to the beginnings of the second revolution that I was referring to. That first revolution has played itself out. That was the nice revolution. You know, when we all discovered freedom, when borders came down, economies open, Francis Fukuyama's end of history, and all that stuff, and now it's all come back to bite us. This is what I call from coherence to chaos. This is, you know, the post-war, post-Second World War order was one of institutions, yes? IMF, World Bank, UN, NATO, and then suddenly all of this begins to come into begins to be called into question. You know, NATO, you know, America, institutions in America begin to crumble. In Russia, there are no institutions. The institutions have all been destroyed. The only institutions that function are the KGB, now the FSB, and GRU. Everything else, you know, the Duma, the parliament, does it function as a parliament should? No. Does the Supreme Court function as a Supreme Court should? No. Do the courts function as courts should? No. Nothing functions as it should. Does media function as it should? No. It's all gone. It's all, you know. So we're looking at the destruction of the elimination of the institutions that we've come to rely on. In political, we know we've got the authoritarians and the populists. We've got Donald, who says anybody who doesn't pay the 2% into NATO, you know, forget it, the Russians can invade. You know, this is the new idea. And we've got Putin. And we've got localized wars, which come out of this elimination of the, or degradation of the institutions. And we have technological change as well, the rise of asymmetric warfare, whereby small forces who use certain technologies cleverly can cause huge problems for much larger forces. We've got Houthis in, is it Houthis or Houthis? Houthis in, you know, creating problems in the Red Sea. We've got, and which also is reflected in, you know, in the cyber sphere with cyber attacks, taking out hacking attacks, cyber attacks, and all these things taking place. And we have generative AI. What is generative AI going to do with us? Can be a very useful tool, but at the same time, there are certain things which are happening with generative AI which are not so good. So this is our second revolution. In this, the mode of communication, we had push out, we had pull in. What's here? Every man is editor. We are all our own editors. We make our own palette of information sources. We look at what we want. We don't follow. If 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we got given a newscast in the evening and we were told what was important, nobody does that anymore. Nobody watches it anymore. It's gone. We all make our own stuff up, and if we don't like it, we find something else. So we have fragmented audiences, we have misinformation, we have disinformation, and worst of all, we have complete collapse of trust in media. Journalists are now regarded with the same low opinion as politicians. They're on exactly the same level. Right? That's new. In terms of how many people trust media, in Scandinavia, you have a situation that is close to paradise. You have a trust rating of 73% in media, right? You know what it is in Greece? 19% trust media. Okay, that's Greece. UK, 31%. France, 33%. United States, something in that region of the 30%. Nobody, I mean, that means that if you put 100 people in a row and only, you know, the rest do not trust regular media anymore. They've gone somewhere else. They're going somewhere else. Where are they going? They're going maybe to misinformation, disinformation, or maybe they're finding their own reliable sources, because, you know, the audience is going wherever it wants to go. Collapse in trust is a huge issue, not just, I mean, it's a huge issue for organizations like Reuters, who have done a big study about collapse in media and what to do to restore media, restore trust in media. Even in here in Norway, there is no complacency, as I heard in the conversation soon after we arrived in Oslo, which said that NRK is worried about collapse in trust in media, in Norwegian media. So this is where we're going. You know, we're going to. I put a question mark, but how we restore some kind of coherence, if we want coherence. Maybe we don't want coherence. Maybe we want everybody to be a rebel. Do we want coherence? It's one of those moments in time when it's crunch time. And this is kind of the thought I came up for this trip. You know, with all that's happening, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in Ukraine, or whether it's in plenty of other places, whether it's in Taiwan, whether it's in the Philippines, we need guidance through the chaos and information. But media, and I use the word editors because I regard myself still kind of as an editor, as one of the people who used to do this stuff and was trusted. No time has editors been trusted to provide it less. People do not like media. And I think my time has run out, and I am happy to move over to questions. I will repeat your question if you ask it, because we can't mic you, or can we?
We're getting a microphone.
We're getting a microphone right now. If you have a question, oh yes, sorry. There's one more slide. Yes. Thanks.
So if you want to ask a question, please line up here. I mean, I'm not devoid of questions, so I might be able to open the ball.
Okay.
So one of the things that I'm wondering, you said at the BBC you hung up your opinions with a quote
Yes.
when it came in.
Yes.
today we're in the era of opinionated media. I'll conjecture that maybe we had a golden age in the post-World War II area, where we had this particular. Everybody was listening to the same things. That information was more fragmented before, and now we're returning to the similar situation. So I'll ask you what you think about the situation today with the opinionated media, and what about my conjecture?
Well, I mean, I have problems with journalists who express their opinions. I remember a conversation when I was asked to talk to some journalists from Radio Liberty in Russia, and one of them said, he was a guy who works in both Russian and Ukrainian, who said that his brand was bigger than the RFERL brand because his opinions counted more than what RFERL was saying. And so for him, you know, RFERL was just kind of a convenient platform. But to hell with the RFERL brand and its traditions, okay? You get that. And at the same time, the studies that are coming out, both by the Reuters just completed study on how to restore faith in journalism, and studies coming out of the US, which ask people, why do they not trust media? And there are two things that people all say. They want accurate media, and they want media without bias. What that means and how you interpret those two statements is quite tricky, because lots of people mean different things by those two words. But people want basically straight information and perhaps analysis, but opinion is not something that people want. People can come up with their own opinion. Is cheap. We all have opinions. There are how many people in this room? There are that many opinions. You know, that's the way it goes. We all have an opinion about something, about everything, we have them. And do we want, I mean, why is a journalist's opinion any better than my own opinion? And if I bother to look up this, and this in different sources and get a general picture of it, why should somebody tell me how to interpret that? I mean, this has been, when we were working, working back in the 70s in the BBC, we didn't want to force our opinion on what was happening to the audience. We wanted the audience to make up its own mind. And at the core of the BBC, the Royal Charter, it mentions two things: accuracy and impartiality as the prime qualities of BBC journalism. Radio Liberty is under a United States Congress law of 1995. Radio Liberty is charged with maintaining accuracy and impartiality. You know, these things have they are at the, and we've kind of moved away from that under various pressures. But the audience tells us, the users tell us still today, that what they want is accurate information and unbiased information. How do you interpret that is difficult. When you say inaccurate, do you mean inaccuracies in stories simply getting it wrong? Or does it mean that in the overall mix, it doesn't reflect the world that people see? I remember visiting some people in rural Wales not very long ago, and they asked where I had worked, and I said, well, I'd worked for the BBC, and they said, oh, we don't watch the BBC anymore. We watch Russia Today. And it's kind of, what? This is like, why would anybody in Wales watch Russia Today? But the answer became clear very quickly. These were quite ordinary people living in the countryside where a car was absolutely essential. Cheap fuel was absolutely essential because they weren't making very much money. And what was happening in France at that time was the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, coming out onto the streets, blocking the roads, creating mayhem. And these people were watching that, and they were associating themselves with that, and they weren't getting coverage from mainstream media in the United Kingdom. And Russia Today was covering it. And Russia Today, the journalists in Russia Today were all trained by either NUUG, the American organization, or the BBC, you know, in how to do proper, good, factual journalism. And all that Russia Today had to do was to go out in the streets of Paris and wherever these gilets jaunes were protesting and cover the protests. Dead simple. I mean, the Russians know, they know how to play into people's dissatisfaction, and what makes them tick is dissatisfaction with this, with that, the other. And so these people started watching Russia Today because they got what they wanted from there. They didn't want Russian propaganda, they just wanted to know what was happening in France.
Yes.
I have a question. Yes. I mean, the world is becoming more and more complex, and you mentioned that we need to know, as people, we need to know what's happening. This is a challenge for journalists because people have less and less time to consume information. How would you educate, I mean, new journalists, young journalists, to be able to squeeze complex information in short and simple formats?
Yeah, I mean, that's very difficult. How do you squeeze complex information into a very short period of time? It's not possible. You do it over time. You have to do it over time by covering issues day in, day out, the issues which are important. You do it in small bits because you can't do it big. If you look at the average watching time, and this goes back sort of 15, 20 years, if you look at the way in which people consume information, it's in short bites of about 1 minute and 30 seconds. That's how long people consume news on social media, and people have moved to social media by and large. That's the main source of information. You have to make it very short, you have to make it very concise, but you need to cover the important issues or take them to something longer form in these short pieces. Your tactic, and this is where the editorial thing comes in, your tactic as an editor in how you cover an issue is extremely important. I did a project in Ukraine, in Kiev. We needed rebroadcasting of news product in Ukraine. This would be about 2006, 2007. And normally we were looking for a rebroadcast of about 10 minutes, between 5 and 10 minutes, to do the news properly. And we were working with a music station, and the music station said, forget it, not interested. 10 minutes? Do you know how much money we lose if we give you 10 minutes? No, not doing it. We lose audience because our audience is here for the music, not for content. So we developed a kind of new format by which we would take the big story of the day and we would do 3 1.5-minute pieces which would go out at different times during the day. We could only hope that somebody would pick up piece 1 in the morning, development at midday, and the third piece development in the evening. But if it was a good story, they might well do that because it would say at the end of the piece, next piece is in a boom, boom, such an hour. But that's what we had to do in order to work with a commercial radio station. We had to change the format of how we did it in terms of how we use the audio in it, because you can't just, have one voice for 1.5 minutes because, the attention span of an FM audience will not take 1.5-minute voice piece, so it has to be, chopped. It has to be quick. It has to move. It has to be 10 seconds at the front for the intro, and then it has 15 seconds for the bum, 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 bum. And you can get quite a lot into a minute and a half. So you outline the story in 1.5 minutes, you develop it in the second, and the conclusion in the third 1.5 minutes. You have to develop these new strategies for TikTok, for wherever people are going. And you have to have the research to know where people are going, what the age group is. It's all about audience. And it used to be one of my things when I was reviewing people is, who is your audience? Do you know your audience? I raised that question once in a review session with the service, and they looked at me and they said, we don't know who our audience is. And I said, well, you're talking to yourselves. You can't do that. It's not possible. So you have to focus on audience ruthlessly and find out what the audience is going to. The thing about AI is that AI enables you to, this is one of the positives of AI, is it enables you to format stuff to go in particular directions that you want. And one person making a story can reformat it for different, for either for mainstream, website, whatever. One person can do that by using generative AI. Generative AI can also be used for a lot of negative things, which I don't think we have time for here, but that is one of the things that's going to come out of it, is journalists being able to exactly tailor stuff for a particular audience, which is fine if people are doing, if they're working, if they're doing good, but it can be abused. If people are, bad actors can use it as much as good actors. It's really, this is the problem with technology.
Yes, I don't know if you know, but we have had in Scandinavia a lot of burning of the Quran, the holy book.
Quran.
Yeah, Quran. And that has created some problems, especially in Sweden and Denmark, with terrorist menaces. And in Norway, the Christians, the church and the mosques and the journalists, they decided not to talk about it. So when the Quran is burned somewhere, nobody talks about it. So that's a kind of censorship. What do you think of that? Is that a good thing, or is it...
Well, I personally wouldn't do it.
No?
I wouldn't do it. I think you have to talk about these things. But I think you have to create a context around it. I think you have to build a context around it. I think you have to have an explanation around it, and you have to build a dialogue. You cannot keep things closed. I don't think, particularly now, it's very difficult to keep things closed. And if you close it, you fester it. Then you give people an excuse to say, they're not talking about it. They're not talking about it. They're lying. Silence is also a lie. They're lying to us. They're not telling us what's happening. Information is information. It's neutral. It's how you present it. It's how you context it. That's what gives you value, if you like, as a news organization. I wouldn't conceal it, but that's me.
So I think maybe we should wrap it up now, if there is no other questions.
Hang on,
you have...
Yes, there's time.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I was just wondering of an opinion from you about the Welsh people.
Yes.
Do you agree with them? And independent of that, what should BBC do?
Do I agree with them about what?
That the BBC doesn't tell anything that's relevant for them.
Well, you see, it's a very... I'm a Welshman, right? I grew up in Wales. And I have a Scottish grandmother as well, so I'm not wholly Welsh. But anyway, I'm a Welshman, so I have mixed feelings. I live in Prague. I don't live there anymore. The BBC has an English language service in Wales, and it has a Welsh language service in Wales. So it covers the issue in both languages. Does it do it for BBC for the nation as a whole? The Welsh would probably complain and say it doesn't. but I think the issue is covered locally. Yeah.
So then I'm going to wrap it up. We had you mentioned generative AI, and there were some troubles with it. Tomorrow we're going to have a seminar in the same building that we are here, just over on the other side of the hallway. I hope as many as you will be able to attend it. And also we are going to the pub right afterwards. I hope you'll join us for some beers. My dear Adriana over here would very much like me to thank the Active Citizens Fund and the Open Society Foundation, because they have been sponsoring TechWatch coming here. So thank you. This is what your money goes to, the EØS-midlene in Norwegian. And I think I'm going to stop with a final, very, very important question to you. Because right before you started, you didn't understand it, but I said that I first and foremost know you as an Arctic explorer. So please tell me, how does it feel to finally be an Arctic explorer?
To be a what?
An Arctic explorer, a man that has
Arctic explorer. Well, for me it was very satisfying personally, because part of my job took me to the Russian Federation. I traveled it from west to east. I won't say from north to south, because I didn't go that far north. I never made it to the Arctic Circle. I never made it to Murmansk. I never made it to Arkhangelsk. I never made it to Vorkuta. I never made it to any of these places up there, and I regretted it. And so when Tom said, well, you're going to go to Mo i Rana, and we said, where's that? And he said, well, it's by the Arctic Circle. I thought, yeah, got to go there. So no, it's been very satisfying to do that.
So we've had Scott, we've had Amundsen, and now we have Frank Williams. Please give it up for Frank.
Thank you.